Well, hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation with Benedict Rogers, an interview series produced by Hong Kong Watch. And it's wonderful to welcome for our final episode of 2022, Michael Sheridan. Michael is a very distinguished journalist. He's had an extensive career across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. First reported from Hong Kong and China at the time of the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, and then served as the Sunday Times Far East correspondent for 20 years. Michael covered the handover of Hong Kong in 1997 and the city's struggle for democracy over 20 years later, and of course the rise of China in recent decades. And he's the author most recently of an excellent book, which I have with me, called The Gate to China, A New History of the People's Republic and Hong Kong, which is now, I have it in hardback, but it is now out in paperback. So Michael Sheridan, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Benedict, and I look forward to talking.
Thank you. Well, let me start by asking, there have been a number of books that have come out in recent years on Hong Kong, but almost all the others, all of which are also excellent, some of whose authors I've also had on this series, mostly focus on the current situation, whereas yours goes quite extensively into history. Could you tell us why you wrote the book and the scope of what it covers?
Well, there is an excellent literature on Hong Kong. It is one of those almost magical places that seems to inspire people to write books and memoirs. And there are a lot of works around, some of them, as you say, very, very good. I felt that what was missing was a history covering the whole recent period, and a book that told the story of how Hong Kong really is linked to the rise of China. You cannot separate the two. So what happens in China has always affected what happened in Hong Kong, less so the other way around, of course. But there was a gap. I also felt it was necessary to write a history that was detached and free from bias, apart from one's fundamental principles, and also rooted in the source material on both sides. We'd had a lot of memoirs from the British stroke Hong Kong side of things. We'd had fewer from the Chinese side, practically none, in fact, translated into English. And this was a gap. I also felt, with all due respect, there was no place for me in this book. It's not about me. I don't appear. It's not a journalistic memoir. It's a work of history. And that, too, was something that I wanted to achieve, and I think I've done so.
And could you say a bit more about the sources that you were able to access and how you went about it, and particularly from the Chinese side?
I had an excellent group of people helping me, and over the years worked with people in China who are scholars, who are grounded in journalistic inquiry, who are very familiar with the history of China, having lived it themselves over many decades. Over some years, we discussed how you would go about building up a resource of material on Hong Kong and China. And it turned out that a lot of material is publicly available. The Guangdong Provincial Archives are open to scholars. They contain fascinating speeches and documents and central government circulars from the 1970s. There are also at least 5 memoirs by principal Chinese actors connected to the negotiations and the handover of Hong Kong. 3 of them are direct memoirs, 2 of them are oral histories. There are also collections at Chinese universities which bring together the memories of officials and cadres who served in Hong Kong and worked on the policy. Remember, this is a success story for the Chinese government as far as they are concerned. The peaceful recovery of Hong Kong in 1997 was a landmark as far as they were concerned, and so it's one they actually wish to commemorate. So getting material from the Chinese side was not, in fact, that difficult. One just had to look.
Mm. And turning to the British side, what would you say, looking at the material and looking at history, What did the UK get right in the preparations for the handover, and what did it get wrong? What were its mistakes?
Well, as with all the British exits from various imperial domains, there was a keen rush to rewrite the history favorably by different people involved afterwards. We had a slew of memoirs. We had Chris Patten went into print quite quickly after he left the governorship in 1997. He since returned to it by publishing his diaries and extensively commenting and giving his side of the case. We also had memoirs by Sir Percy Craddock, who was the British government's chief official involved with Hong Kong policy, really from the early 1980s until the early 1990s. And he continued to exercise a policy influence in the Foreign Office long after his departure. In addition, politicians, Mrs. Thatcher, other ministers contributed their thoughts. A lot of it, by coincidence, most of the governments involved were conservative. So that is just a freak of timing that most of our British recollections come from conservative politicians who have a certain view of the colonial past and of Britain's role as an empire. We're missing a sort of left-wing perspective. I think that's regrettable, but you can find it in other memoirs and people who served in the army and civil servants and so on. So there's a wealth of material there. What I had not read before were the documents. And the documents in the Margaret Thatcher archive at Churchill College, Cambridge, and the private papers of Sir Percy Craddock at St. John's College, Cambridge, turned out to yield a treasure trove of material that I did not know. And I'm someone who's followed Hong Kong for 30 years or more. So in a way, the most rewarding thing was to dig into the confidential memoranda and the handwritten notes and the letters that Mrs. Thatcher kept, because she kept everything. She was a magpie, and she found little nuggets and kept them, and she scribbled notes on her dining card at the Great Hall of the People. We have her typewritten briefing notes with her own handwritten annotations about talking to Zhao Ziyang and to Deng Xiaoping. So all that was very rich. It yielded bits we did not know. And then, of course, Sir Percy Craddock kept his own letters, private letters. All his government papers went into official custody. But that too was a treasure trove of material. We had personal cards and letters from distinguished Chinese personalities. We had his own letters. He kept all sorts of newspaper articles and things which he thought of relevance. And the reason why archives can be a revelation is that Sir Percy Craddock, for example, was a man who almost never gave an interview in his life. He was extremely discreet. He was a figure really from the pages of John le Carré. But for some reason, he decided to leave to posterity some documents and letters recording his most passionate and inmost thoughts on dealing with China. So I found these revelatory. I wove them into the early chapters of the book. If I have one regret, and all authors say this, it is that reviewers and readers have concentrated somewhat on the British negotiating parts of the book, which are in fact only 3 or 4 chapters out of 10. And the second half of the book is all about Hong Kong and all about post-1997 Hong Kong and about the legacy which the British left. The big question, as you raise it, is what mistakes were made. Was it a mistake to negotiate the way they did with the Chinese in the 1980s? Could they have got a better deal in the joint declaration? Was it right to proceed with more democracy after 1992? Was Sir Percy Craddock right when he warned the British government that this would invite retribution from China? These were the questions that really pose themselves again and again, because they are actually part of the lives of Hong Kong people today, because the reality which Hong Kong people are living derives from the negotiated settlements of 1984 and the Basic Law of 1990 and the way that those things are interpreted. So it is a case in which millions of people in Hong Kong and many of those who have moved abroad are living every day with the consequences of those historical decisions. And that's why I think this book is worthwhile.
Mm. Having gone through Margaret Thatcher's archives, can you give us a sense of what she felt about the deal with Deng Xiaoping and Zhao Ziyang, given that she was no friend of communism or dictatorships? She was the Iron Lady who had been one of the pivotal people in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. So what do you think was going through her mind as she negotiated this?
She had a very deep detestation of the communist regime. She was shocked by her first encounter with Deng Xiaoping. She considered him cruel and a hardened Marxist-Leninist. She had no illusions about China at all. She was first escorted around China in the 1970s as leader of the opposition by a man called John Gerson, who was, I have described elsewhere, as a very thoughtful Cold Warrior who was in the diplomatic service and later rose to a high rank in the British intelligence services. So her worldview was very clear. The qualities that Mrs. Thatcher brought to it, you can see in the documents, because you see her again and again questioning the Foreign Office, pushing her negotiators, demanding more. She went into that meeting with Deng Xiaoping, the historic meeting in September 1982, ready to fight. She wanted to keep as much of Hong Kong as possible. It is true, as the Chinese say, that she hoped that Hong Kong Island and the small sliver of Kowloon could remain under British rule in perpetuity and could indeed become independent. She aspired to an independent Hong Kong, and it was with great regret that she accepted during the negotiations that that could not come about. So I think it's very much to Mrs. Thatcher's credit, and I say this as one who was not a natural sympathizer, my mind was changed by what I read, because you saw someone there over years of the documents, very much up close through her own handwritten notes and memoranda. She cared about Hong Kong. She cared about the people. She worked extremely hard. She mastered the detail. When it came to make a hard choice, because accepting the joint declaration was a hard choice, she bit the bullet and she took the decision, and she did not shirk responsibility for it. And to my mind, whether you agree or not, that is what leadership is all about. Nor did she resile from it. She knew that it was not a perfect deal. There's a letter in her archive to President Reagan after the joint declaration was signed. And she said, "I do not pretend that this is ideal in every respect, but I do commend it as a good agreement." And one has to ask, what was the alternative? Could they have got more from the Chinese? Possibly they could have done. How would you have enforced it? Never clear. Percy Craddock himself said that enforcement was a matter of trust. He believed, and he's been rightly criticized for this afterwards, he actually said that the leaders in Beijing are thugs, but they are men of their word. We now know that that's not exactly the case. So the fascinating thing, and I think for Hong Kong people to read as well, is how their fate and the fate of their territory was decided essentially in secret by a small group of people. And I do think the one person really batting for the Hong Kong people was Mrs. Thatcher. One comes away with very little esteem for the officials and the ministers around her, who showed every signs of just wanting to scuttle and run and get on with doing deals with China.
Fascinating. I know you've said that the book is not a personal memoir. You don't feature in it, but you were, of course, at the handover, and you saw the then Prince of Wales, now King Charles, and the last governor, Chris Patten, sail off on Britannia. When you stood there watching the handover, did you predict the turmoil and the total dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms that we've seen 25 years later?
At the handover, there was a lot of conventional wisdom around, both among the journalists and the diplomats and business people. I personally was not so pessimistic because I thought that Hong Kong was very pragmatic and that the people running the administration at the time, I'd interviewed Tong Chihua, for example, at some length. He was a reassuring, paternal, avuncular figure. Very hard to imagine Tong Chihua doing something cruel or bad. Anson Chan, very respected, highly competent, a strong sense of public service. One felt at that point that Hong Kong was in good hands. So the question then arises, how is Hong Kong linked to China? And the conventional wisdom, I think it's fair to say, among the journalists was that the Communist Party was finished and it would eventually collapse. It would go the way of Eastern Europe, and that communist rule would eventually come to an end. For those of us who were in China in 1989, and I witnessed the mass demonstrations in Shanghai, which were tolerated by Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, it was hard to escape a sense that the Chinese people had indeed stood up for a second time. It's equally fair to say that the conventional wisdom among business and diplomacy was that economic reform in China was irreversible and that economic reform would lead to political progress and to moves towards greater liberalization and greater democracy and China opening to the world. Well, we now know that both camps were wrong, that the Communist Party did not collapse, and equally that economic liberalization, such as it was, and it's been critiqued now by people like Frank de Kuyter quite effectively, did not lead to political progress. We have seen an entirely new model emerge in China, and the way it has played out on the streets of Hong Kong really shapes the second half of the book, because you see China going in one direction, particularly after 2012, and Hong Kong resolutely going in another direction. These were always irreconcilable directions of travel. And eventually it was going to be settled, and it has now been settled, and the Chinese government has emerged supreme.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Turning to the present day situation, we're speaking just a few days after Jimmy Lai was given another sentence. He's of course faced multiple different charges, but the latest sentence a 5-year sentence. And of course his national security law trial, which I understand has now been postponed until September next year. What are your reflections on his particular case and the closure of Apple Daily? Also, of course, the trial coming up of the Stand News journalists, and what this all means for press freedom in Hong Kong.
It's really painful to see these remarkable people who chose to stay in Hong Kong facing trial and imprisonment for activities that are in fact permitted under the Chinese constitution's own guarantees of speech, assembly, and so forth, which are on paper perfectly valid. As I think it was Agnes Chow said in a televised confrontation with Carrie Lam, we can all pretend the Chinese constitution means what it says. What's happening in Hong Kong is tragic. These are people who have done absolutely nothing wrong by any world standards. Jimmy Lai, of course, I've met in the past. He's just a remarkable volcanic figure, a man of many parts who had this extraordinary career. He didn't have to do Apple Daily. He made loads of money in other forms. And then all the people who worked on Apple Daily and in that other part of the Hong Kong media, which I worked alongside for many years at events and great occasions. Terrific bunch of journalists, really keen, so sharp, very vigorous. Ride in a Hong Kong taxi and listen to the cacophony of voices on the radio and the talk shows, and even on the multiple television channels, there was so much discourse and debate and exchange. Any idea that Chinese people are some way predisposed to just obey and accept authority is a load of nonsense. And the Hong Kong press and the literary scene, the publishing scene, was an absolutely dynamic reservoir of genius for China. It kept the flame alive for half a century after the People's Republic. And it's tragic to see it being dismantled. What I fear for those in custody and those under the sword of Damocles for prosecution is that this will now be an endless process, because that's what the Communist Party does. We've seen the flimsy charges, the pretexts, the administrative offences, the ways in which prosecutors have found absurd ways to put people on trial and convict them. It is an endless fount of legal resource. I regrettably think that very few of those people are going to come out of prison at all for the next few years. In some cases, like Jimmy Lai and some of the older people, this may amount to a life sentence. I wish there was more we could do about it. I would like to see Magnitsky-type sanctions applied more rigorously and more widely in Hong Kong. I'd like to see Western government get on with that. The Americans are already doing it. We can't do nothing. We also need to think very hard about the presence of foreign judges on the Hong Kong courts, because John Lee has himself said that their presence lends legitimacy to the system. So they're very hard moral choices here. Remarkable people like Jonathan Sumption, the law lord and distinguished scholar in the UK, have made a convincing case for the value of keeping foreign judges. Myself, I think that time has passed. But Hong Kong is not off the agenda, far from it. It's going to come back up the agenda next year as these cases continue. And as press freedom, sadly, goes away, I do think there will be many, many ways of preserving press freedom, debate and dialogue from outside Hong Kong, because they cannot shut the city off from the internet altogether.
Just building on those excellent points about what should be done. I mean, Hong Kong Watch absolutely advocates for Magnitsky sanctions. Why do you think it is that the British government, and indeed other governments, but thinking particularly of the UK, has on the one hand introduced this very generous B&O scheme to help Hong Kongers who want to leave the city find a new home in the UK, but on the other hand have still now, more than 2 years after the imposition of the national security law, not introduced any sanctions?
Well, obviously we all applaud the B&O scheme. It's very inspiring to see thousands of Hong Kong families settling, in fact, in London and the southeast, quite a few in North London. By and large, the most positive and excellent response to their arrival. They're going to bring a great deal to this country. A great pity, in my view, that the policy was not more liberal 20 or 30 years ago. We might have built better bonds between the United Kingdom and Hong Kong and had that gateway, the gate to China, the gate to the East Asian economies. But there we are. That's happening. Sanctions are a hard call. And I'm very aware that it's easy for journalists and writers to say, you must do this and you must do that. But ministers decide and then the consequences happen. And China practices hostage diplomacy. There are an awful lot of British people and British interests in Hong Kong and also in China. And any government has to think very hard about how you deal with a authoritarian stroke totalitarian dictatorship that has zero scruples. So I think they are weighing up very carefully targeted sanctions against individuals, but they don't want to implement them because they fear retribution. And nobody wants to get into a hostage situation with China. It would be very destructive for Hong Kong as well, because the revival from the idiocy of zero COVID and their policies for the last few years is going to require more trade, exchange with foreign countries, commerce with the rest of the world. Hong Kong needs to open up, not shut down. And if executives or business people feared they might be singled out for targeting and retribution, that would be a break on that. It's really difficult. One of the things, the history teaches is how do you deal with dictatorships? In that sense, Hong Kong and its people are pawns. They are hostages. And although it's easy for, as I say, journalists and writers to say things, I moderated my own position over the years to come to realize that perhaps the Hippocratic principle that first do no harm is the way to go. We don't want to see a situation where life gets worse for people in Hong Kong. We want to see a situation where the place has a chance to progress and evolve and expand. The regime of Xi Jinping will not last forever, and China has shown an immense capacity for change and reform. And you have to be optimistic in the long run, but in the short run, it's going to be rough.
Mm. We're almost out of time, but let me ask you, as we come towards the end of this year, the 25th anniversary year of the handover, and we prepare for a new year, what final message would you have for people watching this, particularly Hong Kongers?
I would be optimistic and resilient, and I think that great Chinese virtue of patience is something that can be rewarded. These dictatorships are built on feet of clay. The effects of protest in mainland China, just in the last few weeks, the way in which the Chinese government has been forced into a U-turn over its COVID policies, is an example of the unexpected. I'm not qualified to give a medical judgment or a sociological judgment on the effects, but the fact is it does show that things in China can change unexpectedly and quickly. So even if the Xi Jinping regime continues on its stately course, China will change. There's a strong young generation, particularly in Hong Kong, but also in China. We saw some of those voices on social media over the last few weeks from inside China, things that we hadn't seen or heard for decades, of people explicitly speaking out against restrictions on their own freedoms to go about their daily lives. And in a sense, that feeling in 1989 that the fear had gone came back again. Mm. The fear went in 1989. I was in the streets of Shanghai with 1 million people. The police were standing by. Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji handled those protests in a most enlightened way. There was no massacre. Shanghai progressed. The direction of travel is not always in the hands of bloodthirsty bullies and tyrants. So I would be optimistic. I'd be patient. I wouldn't give in. I think you've got to make it difficult for them all the time. But I do think that the qualities of Hong Kong, its international connections, its special place in southern China, made it the gate to China. It's still the gate to China. And business and commerce bring social intercourse and rewards and exchanges and culture. So yes, optimistic in the long term, but hedge your bets and have no illusions.
Well, that's a very good note on which to end this conversation. There's many more questions I could have asked you, but as always, these episodes are time limited. But I would just end by saying that I recommend The Gate to China, which I've read. I hope others will read it. And Michael Sheridan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.